Everyone knows that there are four Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the biographies of Christ that the New Testament contains, but very few people ask, if these are biographies, why do we call them Gospels? Well, there's an interesting and a surprising answer to that. Let's get to it. Howdy, folks. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell notification so you'll always get notified when I have a new video. And you can help me keep making this podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Last episode, we talked about how the New Testament understands the concept of the gospel, and we saw that a lot of the popular definitions just do not correspond to how the New Testament uses the term. For example, the gospel is not identical with the message of how to get saved. The gospel has implications for our salvation, that's certainly true, but in the New Testament, the gospel is not fundamentally about us. It's about God and about Jesus. You can listen to last episode for more information on that. What we're doing today is looking at a related question, which is why we refer to the biographies of Christ in the New Testament as Gospels. How did they get that name? God may have created man in his image, but there is a well-known tendency among biblical scholars to recreate Jesus in their own image. The tendency is particularly notable among skeptical scholars who feel more free than their conservative counterparts to dismiss or discount gospel passages that don't fit into their theories. In writing books on the life of Jesus, they can select, filter, and interpret the evidence in a way that allows them to find the kind of Jesus they want, often one that is an idealized form of their own self-image. Thus, a Marxist scholar might read the Gospels and discover that Jesus is a proto-Marxist revolutionary martyr that led a peasant uprising and then fell afoul of the powerful and moneyed upper classes. Big surprise. The tendency is so common that it led the British biblical scholar T.W. Manson to quip, "By their lives of Jesus, ye shall know them." This is a cutting insight about the foibles of biblical scholars, but it's also something else, an unwitting reflection of what the Gospels might have been called if history had taken a different path. Manson's remark turns on the fact that modern scholars tend to write books with titles like The Life of Christ or Life of Jesus. Search Amazon and you'll find multiple books with both titles as well as variants on them. And there's a good reason for that. They are, after all, books about the life of Jesus. They are, in fact, a specialized kind of biography, not the typical sort of biography that you'll find in the biographical section of a bookstore today, if they even have bookstores today. We don't have the right kind and number of sources about the life of Jesus to compose that kind of biography. But scholarly lives of Jesus are nonetheless a form of life writing, or from its Greek roots, bios and graphe, from which we get biography. The principal sources for modern lives of Jesus are, of course, the Gospels, and that raises a question. Why aren't the Gospels called lives of Jesus? They are, just like the modern lives of Jesus, about the life of Jesus. They are biographies. Specifically, they fall within the ancient Greek literary genre known as the bios, or life. Given that, we would expect them to have titles like Bios Jesu, or in Greek, Life of Jesus, or Bios Christou, or in Greek, Life of Christ, or some similar variant. Some ancient biographies were simply referred to by the name of the person who was their subject. Thus, in Suetonius's De Vitis Caesarum, or On the Lives of the Caesars, the individual volumes in the series are just called Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, and so forth. On that model, the Gospels might have simply been called Jesus, Christos, Jesus Christos, or a similar variant. Whichever model would have been used, ancient biographies tended to have either the word life or the name of the subject or both in their titles. So why don't the Gospels? Today, authors typically propose titles for their books, but publishers make the final decision. They may overrule the author's proposal if they think they have a title that will sell more copies. In the ancient world, though, things were different. For one thing, there were no publishing houses. All books were self-published by their authors, which meant that the author could publish a book under any title he wanted. Yet many authors refrained from doing so. Surprising as it may seem, they sometimes even released books without titles. However, if the book proved popular, there needed to be some way to refer to it, and so it ended up getting a title anyway. This title was bestowed by those who used the book, such as by the booksellers who had the copies made, the librarians who archived it, or the members of the public who read and promoted it. Even if an author gave his book a title, this could be trumped by the users of the book. Consequently, a book sometimes was given more than one title. Yet the Gospels weren't. It's often claimed that the Gospels circulated for a long time without any titles or authors, that the titles and authors were added at a much later date, perhaps in the 2nd century. If that is what happened, then, as German scholar Martin Hengel pointed out, we would expect to find copies of the Gospels or other early writings referring to them by multiple different titles and authors, and we don't. Instead, we find them called things like Kata Mathathion, or Kata Markon, Kata Lukan, and Kata Ioannein, which mean according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John, respectively. Or we might find them called things like Evangelion Kata Mathion, or Gospel according to Matthew, and the expected variants for the other three. On this model, neither the word life, or bios, nor the name of the subject, Jesus or Jesus, appears in the title. Why not? The books of the Hebrew Scriptures commonly go by different names than we use in English. For example, Genesis is known as Breshit, and Exodus is known as Shemot. These names are taken from the opening verses of the books. Breshit means in the beginning, which is famous from the opening verse of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Shemot means names, which is also taken from the opening verse of Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. This may provide the key to why the biographies of Jesus are called Gospels rather than Lives of Jesus. One of the surprising things about the Gospels is how small a role the word gospel actually plays in them. The term gospel, or in Greek euangelion, and its verb form, evangelize or euangelizo, appear 130 times in the New Testament, which you can break down by what books they appear in. When you do that, you find that the terms gospel and evangelize are overwhelmingly most common in Paul. There are 81 occurrences of the words in Paul, but only 5 in Matthew, 8 in Mark, 19 in Luke, and none in John. This is even more striking because each of the Gospels is longer than any single one of Paul's letters, yet the terms are used less frequently in each of them. The raw number of occurrences of gospel and evangelize are instructive, but they are more so when we adjust or renormalize them based on the lengths of the works in question. To do that, we need to know the number of words in the Greek texts of each of the sources. If we then divide these word counts by the number of occurrences of the words gospel and evangelize, we get some intriguing results. The entries listed NA indicate places where the overall word count would have to be divided by 0, which is not allowed because the word gospel never occurs in the works in question. The other entries indicate how many words of a given text you would need to read in order to, on average, encounter one occurrence of gospel or evangelize. Thus, in Matthew, you would need to read around 3,669 words to encounter either of these words. These averages make it clear that gospel and evangelize are one of Paul's favorite items of vocabulary. You only need to read 400 words in Paul to encounter one of them. They're also favored words of Peter. You'd need to read 696 of Peter's words to encounter one of them. Among the Gospels and Acts, these terms are favored by Luke, who uses them for about 1 in 1,000 words of his Gospel and Acts. They are slightly less common in Mark, who uses them for about 1 in 1,400 of his words. Matthew uses them less frequently, about 1 in 3,700 words, and John doesn't use them at all. From this, we may draw the general lesson that gospel and evangelize were favored terms by Paul and Peter, and they were used to a similar but lesser extent by their associates Luke and Mark. Other New Testament authors used them less frequently or not at all. For our purposes, the most important thing is not the average number of words per mention of gospel and evangelize, but how soon the relevant term appears. If the name gospel is based on the first verse of the work in question, as in the books of the Hebrew Bible, what could be responsible? Well, here are the first verses of each gospel. Mark begins, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Matthew begins, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Luke begins, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us. And John begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. From this, it would seem that only Mark could have served as the origin of the term gospel in the titles, for only he uses it in the first verse of his work. Even if we expand our scope beyond the first verse, other gospels would not have been the source. In Matthew, gospel or evangelize doesn't appear until the 4th chapter, and in Luke, it doesn't appear until the 19th verse. And, of course, in John, it doesn't appear at all. The strong suggestion, then, is that the Gospels are called Gospels because Mark included this word in his very first verse. Does Mark's first verse hold the key to why we call the original biographies of Jesus Gospels rather than lives? The British scholar B.H. Streeter thought so. He wrote, "The worldwide circulation of Mark affords an easy and natural explanation of what, from a purely linguistic point of view, is the rather curious usage by which the word gospel became the technical name for a biography of Christ. The Greek word euangelion simply means good news, and in the New Testament it is always used in its original sense of the good news of the Christian message. Commentators have tried elaborately to trace a gradual evolution in the meaning of the word until it acquired this new usage. No such gradual evolution is necessary or even probable. Among the Jews, it was a regular practice to refer to books or sections of books by a striking word which occurred in the opening sentence. That is how Genesis and Exodus derived the titles by which they're known in the Hebrew Bible, that is, in the beginning, and these are the names. As soon as portions of Mark were read in the services of the church, and that would be at once, it would be necessary to have a name to distinguish this reading from that of an Old Testament book. Mark opens with the words arche tu euangeliou, the beginning of the gospel. Arche, or beginning in Greek, would be too like the Hebrew name for Genesis, so euangelion would be an obvious title. When, 15 or 20 years later, other lives of Christ came into existence, this use of gospel as a title would be an old established custom and would be applied to them also. Then it would become necessary to distinguish these gospels from one another, hence the usage ta euangelion, kata Markon, kata Lukon, the gospel according to Mark, to Luke, etc. According to the figures we've looked at, gospel and evangelize appear to be Paul's preferred terms. They occur more frequently in his writings than in other books of the New Testament. Since Mark was a companion of Paul, he could have gotten his usage of the term from Paul. However, Mark was only a companion of Paul for a short time during his first missionary journey, and Paul refused to take him on the second missionary journey. This leaves us with the question of whether Mark may have picked up his use of gospel and evangelize from Peter. We first learn of Mark when we read that Peter went to the house of Mark's mother in Jerusalem, and later we learn that he was with Peter in Rome. Multiple sources from among the church fathers indicate that Mark served for a long time as Peter's companion and interpreter, which may mean that he picked up his use of the term gospel and evangelize from Peter. Based on our renormalization of the references to gospel and evangelize with the length of the New Testament sources, this suggestion is a plausible one. Peter and Mark use the pair of terms almost as often as Paul and Luke, and both pairs use it much more frequently than other New Testament sources. This suggests that Mark's use of these terms may be based on Peter's. It also suggests, given Paul's derivative status as an apostle, that he likely picked up this usage from others, perhaps including Peter, and that he then made this usage his own in a special way and passed on the usage to Luke. However gospel found its way into the first verse of Mark, this is very probably the basis on which the other first-century biographies of Jesus came to be called Gospels, and this has implications for the order in which they were written. As Streeter suggests, if Mark was the first gospel written and read in the churches, it would have been necessary to give it some form of title to distinguish it from the various Old Testament readings that were already established. Thus, there would need to be an equivalent in the ancient world for the modern liturgical statement, a reading from the gospel according to Mark. Even if the phrase according to Mark had not yet been added due to the lack of other gospels, a statement like a reading from the gospel would need to have been used. When Matthew, Luke, and John were written, the modifiers according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John would then have been introduced. However, if one of the others had come first, the use of the term gospel would be difficult to explain. None of the others use the term gospel or euangelion in their first verse or near it, and it would have been much more likely that the natural term bios or life, or the name of the subject, Jesus Christ or Jesus Christ, would have been used instead, the same way that Suetonius used titles for his biographies like Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. The best explanation of the data we have is thus that Mark was the first gospel written and that his initial verse, with its term gospel in that first verse, supplied the name for the reading of his work in the liturgy. When Matthew, Luke, and John later wrote similar works, they came to be called by this title, and then the attribution to the author, according to so-and-so, was introduced. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. And you can help me keep making this podcast and get early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you always.